Most strange stories begin in places that feel completely ordinary at first, places where nothing unusual is supposed to happen, and where people believe every sound has a simple explanation. A quiet forest trail, for example, usually brings to mind fresh air, long walks, and the peaceful feeling of being far away from the noise of cities. People go there to clear their thoughts, to enjoy the silence, and to feel like they are alone with nature. But sometimes that same silence can hide things that nobody expects. Sometimes a person walks into a place thinking they understand it, only to slowly realize that something unseen has been paying attention the entire time. When strange things begin in those quiet places, people often try to explain them away at first, assuming it must be coincidence, or a trick of memory, or maybe just the imagination reacting to the isolation. Yet there are certain situations where the explanations stop making sense, where small details begin to add up in ways that make the situation feel deeply wrong. This particular story started with a simple hiking trip taken by a man who only wanted a few quiet days away from work. And for a while, everything seemed normal. But by the end of it, the evidence he found suggested that someone else had been there with him the entire time, watching, documenting, and leaving behind proof that would make the whole trip feel like something far more disturbing than an ordinary walk through the woods. Before we start, please subscribe if you haven't already. The man's name was Daniel Mercer, a quiet 32-year-old graphic designer who spent most of his time indoors working long hours on a computer. And like many people who sit behind screens all week, he had started taking short hiking trips on the weekends because he said the forest helped clear his mind and made him feel like the world slowed down for a while. He was not the type of person who went on extreme adventures or dangerous expeditions. He simply liked marked trails, a small backpack, and a few hours of quiet walking under tall trees where there were no phones ringing and no emails waiting. One autumn weekend, he decided to visit a remote national forest several hours away from the nearest town, a place known mostly by locals and experienced hikers, because the trails were longer and less crowded than the parks closer to the city. The morning he arrived, the sky was gray, and the air smelled like damp leaves, and the parking area held only two other vehicles, which made Daniel feel satisfied, because he preferred empty trails where he could walk for hours without running into groups of people. He checked the trail map posted near the entrance, chose a loop path that would take most of the afternoon to finish, and started walking deeper into the forest where the trees grew taller, and the sounds of the road slowly faded until the only things he could hear were wind moving through branches and the steady rhythm of his own footsteps over dirt and fallen leaves. For the first couple of hours, nothing unusual happened. Daniel walked at a comfortable pace, occasionally stopping to drink water or take pictures of the scenery with his phone. The forest felt calm in the way remote forests usually do, quiet but not empty, because small sounds always existed somewhere in the distance, like birds calling, twigs snapping under animals moving through the brush, or leaves shifting whenever the wind passed through. Around the middle of the afternoon, he stepped off the trail briefly to sit on a fallen log and eat a sandwich he had packed. And while he was resting, he noticed something lying half buried beneath a layer of wet leaves several feet away from where he sat. At first it looked like a piece of black plastic, but when he brushed away the leaves, he realized it was an old digital camera. It was one of the compact models that had been common about 10 or 15 years earlier, the kind with a small screen on the back and a sliding cover protecting the lens. The surface was scratched and dirty, but it did not appear completely ruined by weather, which made Daniel assume that someone must have dropped it during a hike sometime in the past few months. Because the forest was far from town, he doubted anyone would come looking for it. So he placed it in his backpack, thinking he might check the memory card later to see if there was any identifying information that could help return it. He finished eating, brushed dirt from his hands, and continued along the trail without thinking much more about the camera at the time. The rest of the hike felt uneventful, and by early evening he returned to the parking area where the two other vehicles had already left. He drove to a small motel in the nearby town where he planned to stay the night before heading home the next morning. And after showering, he remembered the camera sitting inside his backpack. Curious, he placed it on the small desk in the motel room and slid open the lens cover. To his mild surprise, the device powered on immediately, the small screen glowing with a blue startup symbol before displaying a simple menu. The battery indicator showed nearly half a charge, which seemed strange for a camera left in the forest long enough to become covered in leaves. But Daniel assumed maybe it had been dropped recently. He navigated through the menu until he reached the photo gallery, expecting to see old vacation pictures or random nature shots left behind by whoever had lost it. The first images looked ordinary enough. Several photos showed forest trails, tall trees, patches of sunlight breaking through branches, and what appeared to be the same general area where Daniel had been hiking earlier that day. The dates on the photos were recent, all taken within the past week. He scrolled through them slowly, assuming they belonged to another hiker who had visited recently and accidentally dropped the camera. Then he reached a photo that made him pause. The image showed a man standing on a forest trail several yards away from the camera, adjusting the straps of his backpack while looking down at the ground. The man in the picture was Daniel. At first he assumed it must be a coincidence, perhaps another hiker who happened to resemble him. But when he zoomed in slightly, he could clearly see the exact same jacket he had worn earlier that day, the same blue backpack resting against his shoulders, and the same trail marker behind him that he distinctly remembered passing not long before finding the camera. He continued scrolling. Another image appeared, this time showing Daniel sitting on the fallen log while eating his sandwich, his head slightly turned as if he had just heard something in the distance. The angle of the photo suggested it had been taken from behind a cluster of trees several yards away, hidden enough that the person holding the camera would not easily be seen from the trail. Daniel felt a slow, uncomfortable sensation creep through his stomach as he kept flipping through the photos. Each one showed him during the hike that afternoon. One photo captured him tying his shoe. Another showed him walking along the trail from behind. Another showed him standing near a stream reading the trail map. Every image had clearly been taken by someone watching him from a distance. The timestamps confirmed they had been taken earlier that same day, during the exact hours he had been hiking alone. Daniel sat back in the motel chair staring at the small screen, trying to think of a reasonable explanation. Perhaps another hiker had been on the trail after all, someone who enjoyed photography and happened to notice Daniel walking ahead of them. Maybe they had taken pictures of the landscape and accidentally captured him in the frame. That explanation seemed possible at first, but as he kept scrolling through the gallery, it began to feel less convincing. Many of the photos were clearly focused on him. Some were taken from extremely close distances. One image showed him from behind a large tree trunk only a few feet away, the bark filling half the frame while Daniel stood unaware just beyond it. Another showed him crouched near the ground examining a mushroom, taken from behind a bush so close that the leaves partially blocked the lens. The person taking these photos had been hiding, and they had been very close. Daniel felt the quiet motel room suddenly seem smaller and less comfortable as he kept reviewing the images. The final photo in the gallery showed something that made him stop breathing for a moment. It was a picture of Daniel kneeling beside the exact spot where he had discovered the camera earlier that afternoon. The image showed him brushing leaves away from the ground. The timestamp placed it less than 30 seconds before he had picked up the camera, which meant the person who took that photo had been standing nearby watching him find it. After that image, there were no more photos. Daniel turned the camera over in his hands, checking for anything unusual, but the device looked completely ordinary aside from the scratches on its casing. He checked the memory card folder again, thinking maybe the images had been transferred from another device or edited somehow. But the timestamps and file data all appeared normal. He told himself that whoever took the pictures must have been playing some kind of strange prank, maybe someone who enjoyed secretly photographing hikers for entertainment, and then abandoned the camera when they noticed Daniel had discovered it. But the uneasy feeling stayed with him for the rest of the night. Sleep did not come easily, and when it finally did, the dreams that followed were strangely vivid. In the dreams, Daniel walked along the same forest trail again, hearing footsteps behind him that always stopped whenever he turned around. And somewhere between the trees, he kept seeing the faint reflection of a camera lens catching light before disappearing into shadow. He woke several times during the night with the uncomfortable feeling that someone had been standing near the motel room door, even though the hallway outside remained completely silent whenever he checked. The next morning, he packed his things and drove home, telling himself the entire situation was probably harmless. Maybe the photographer had simply lost their camera while hiking and never returned to retrieve it. For a few days, Daniel avoided thinking about the images. Then one evening, while transferring the photos from the camera onto his computer, he noticed something he had somehow missed before. The timestamps on the final group of pictures were slightly inconsistent. Most of them matched the exact times he remembered being at certain places along the trail, but 3 photos near the end showed timestamps several hours earlier than the others. Curious, he opened those images again. The first one showed the forest trail early in the morning, long before Daniel had even arrived at the park. The second showed the empty parking lot with only one vehicle visible, Daniel's car. The third image showed Daniel stepping out of his vehicle, stretching his arms after the long drive while looking around the quiet parking area, which meant the person with the camera had been there before he even started the hike. Daniel slowly leaned back in his chair as a new possibility formed in his mind, something that made the situation feel far more disturbing than he had first believed. Whoever had been taking the photos had not simply encountered him by chance. They had been waiting. That realization alone would have been unsettling enough, but what Daniel discovered next made everything far worse. While zooming into one of the earlier images, he noticed a faint reflection in a small puddle near the trail. The reflection showed the lower half of the photographer, worn hiking boots, dark pants, and hanging from their belt, partially visible in the reflection, was another camera, a newer one, which meant the old camera Daniel had found was not the photographer's only device. Someone had been carefully documenting his entire trip, and they still had the second camera. Daniel spent the next few days trying to convince himself that whoever had taken those photos was probably just an eccentric photographer with strange habits. But that explanation fell apart the following week when he opened his email one evening and saw a message from an unknown address. There was no text in the email, only a single image attachment. When he opened it, the photo showed Daniel sitting at his desk inside his apartment earlier that same evening, illuminated by the glow of his computer screen. The picture had clearly been taken from outside his window, and in the faint reflection on the glass behind him, barely visible but unmistakable, someone stood quietly holding a camera, which meant the person who had followed him through the forest had never stopped watching him at all. Months later, investigators would uncover the truth behind the photographs, a truth that made the entire story even darker than Daniel had imagined. The old camera he found in the forest had belonged to a man who had been living secretly in the woods for nearly 3 years, a former wildlife photographer who had slowly developed an obsession with documenting strangers without their knowledge. At first, he had taken pictures of hikers from a distance simply out of curiosity. But over time, the behavior became more personal and more invasive as he began selecting specific individuals to follow and observe for days or even weeks. The forest camera had been left intentionally where Daniel would find it, because the photographer enjoyed the moment when his chosen subject realized they had been watched all along. Investigators eventually discovered thousands of images stored on hidden hard drives inside a small cabin deep in the forest. Photos showing dozens of hikers during private moments when they believed they were completely alone. But the most disturbing discovery was that Daniel's photos had been placed in a separate folder labeled with a single word: beginning. Because the photographer had written detailed notes explaining that Daniel had reacted exactly the way he hoped someone would react after finding the camera, which meant the real documentation of Daniel's life had only started after the hiking trip ended. And by the time police finally identified the man responsible, he had already disappeared from the cabin without leaving a single trace behind, taking his cameras with him and leaving investigators with the uneasy conclusion that somewhere out there, he was still quietly watching someone new, patiently waiting for the moment they would discover a forgotten camera and realize they had never been alone at all.